Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the gilded corridors of Versailles in 1770, where a 14-year-old girl with porcelain skin and cornflower blue eyes is about to discover that her primary job description as Queen of France involves one thing: getting pregnant and staying pregnant until her body gives out. Picture this. It's a crisp May morning, and somewhere in the Austrian countryside a carriage rolls toward the French border, carrying what essentially amounts to the most expensive breeding mare in European history. Her name is Marie Antonia Josepha Johanna, though history will remember her as Marie Antoinette, and she has no idea that she's about to become the human equivalent of a baby factory for the next 2 decades. So if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The journey that brought Marie Antoinette to France began not with romance or even political idealism, but with the cold calculations of 18th century realpolitik Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Marie Antoinette's mother had spent years orchestrating what she called the reversal of alliances, flipping centuries of Habsburg, Bourbon rivalry into a strategic partnership that would reshape European power dynamic. The centerpiece of this diplomatic revolution was simple. Her youngest daughter's womb, Maria Theresa, understood that treaties could be broken with a stroke of a pen, but bloodlines created bonds that lasted generations. If Marie Antoinette could produce a French heir with Austrian blood, the alliance between Vienna and Versailles would be written into the genetic code of future European royalty. The Empress had been preparing her daughter for this reproductive destiny since childhood, drilling her in the arts of courtly charm, while simultaneously educating her about the paramount importance of fertility. In royal marriage, Marie Antoinette's education included pregnancy, or how many months between births was optimal, which seasons were best for conception, and how to maintain her health through the endless cycle of pregnancy and recovery that awaited her. The mainstream historical consensus confirms that Marie Antoinette was indeed chosen specifically for her youth and presumed fertility, as 14 was considered the optimal age for a royal bride to begin her reproductive career. Her mother's letters to French diplomats made no secret of this priority, with Maria Theresa explicitly stating that her daughter's principal duty would be to provide France with heirs and secure the Austrian alliance through her fertility. The journey from Vienna to Versailles took on the character of a fertility pilgrimage, with Marie Antoinette accompanied by a traveling pharmacy of herbs and tonics designed to optimize her reproductive health. Her Austrian physicians had prepared detailed instructions for their French counterparts, including dietary recommendations, exercise regimens, and even specific prayers that were believed to enhance conception. Some scholars debate whether Marie Antoinette fully understood the biological expectations being placed upon her, with some arguing that her apparent naivety about marital duties was genuine, while others suggest it was a carefully cultivated innocence designed to preserve her value as dynastic breeding stock. The ceremonial handover at the French border reveals the dehumanizing nature of royal marriage in the 18th century. Marie Antoinette was required to strip completely naked in a specially constructed pavilion, surrender every article of Austrian clothing and jewelry, and be redressed entirely in French garments, a keen symbolic transformation that extended to her very identity as a reproductive vessel. This bizarre ritual, known as the remise, was designed to ensure that nothing Austrian touched French soil except Marie Antoinette herself, though the irony wasn't lost on observers that what France really wanted was her off. Even her undergarments were replaced, as if French lace could somehow enhance her capacity for conception. The French courtiers waiting to receive their new Dauphine had spent months preparing for what they openly referred to as the arrival of the breeding stock. Court physicians had already drawn up detailed schedules for monitoring her menstrual cycles, planning conception attempts, and managing her pregnancies with the precision of a military campaign. The royal bedroom at Versailles had been redesigned specifically to accommodate the medical apparatus needed for royal childbirth, complete with specialized furniture for labor and recovery. French nobles placed bets on how quickly their new Dauphine would conceive, with the most optimistic wagering that she would be pregnant within 6 months of her marriage to the future Louis Bigzy. As Marie Antoinette's carriage approached Versailles for the first time, she could see the palace's glittering facade reflected in the late afternoon sun-cow monument to absolute monarchy that would become both her prison and her breeding ground. The palace's architects had recently completed renovations to the royal apartments, specifically designed to optimize conditions for royal pregnancy, in specialized chambers for prenatal care. The courtiers who lined the palace courtyard to greet their new Dauphine were already mentally calculating her reproductive timeline, whispering about her hips, her complexion, and other physical attributes that might indicate her suitability for repeated pregnancies. Marie Antoinette's first dinner at Versailles included dishes, pomegranates, and various herbs that 18th-century medicine believed could stimulate conception. Her Austrian ladies-in-waiting had been dismissed at the border, replaced by French attendants, whose primary qualification was their expertise in managing royal pregnancies and monitoring signs of conception. The new Dauphine's daily schedule was immediately restructured around shepherding her reproductive health, with mandatory walks in the palace gardens, prescribed rest periods, and carefully monitored interactions with her future husband designed to facilitate the earliest possible conception. Court physicians conducted what they delicately termed examinations of readiness, essentially evaluating Marie Antoinette's physical development and determining when she would be prepared for the intensive reproductive schedule that French royal protocol demanded. The pressure for immediate pregnancy was so intense that Marie Antoinette's Austrian mother began writing weekly letters within days of her daughter's arrival, inquiring about her menstruatie. These maternal instructions, preserved in the Austrian state archives, read like a medieval fertility manual, complete with dietary recommendations, sexual positions, and timing strategies designed to maximize the chances of pregnancy. The French court's obsession with Marie Antoinette's reproductive potential created an atmosphere where her every gesture was analyzed, the signs of pregnancy, her appetite monitored for morning sickness, and her clothing examined for evidence for physical changes. Even her choice of perfumes became a subject of medical consultation, as court physicians debated whether certain scents might stimulate or inhibit conception. The irony that would soon become apparent was that despite all this preparation, planning, and pressure, Marie Antoinette's reproductive destiny would prove far more complicated, tragic, and politically charged than anyone at Versailles could have imagined. In those first hopeful days of 1770, the wedding ceremony on May 16, 1770, at Versailles, was everything an 18th-century royal spectacle should be: thousands of guests, enough diamonds to blind a small army, and a wedding dress so elaborate it required its own architectural support system. What it wasn't, however, was the beginning of France's reproductive salvation. The 15-year-old Marie Antoinette stood beside her 16-year-old groom, the future Louis XV, in a ceremony that cost more than most European nations' annual budgets. While courtiers mentally started their pregnancy countdown clocks, the newlyweds retired to their specially prepared marriage chamber amid expectations that French royal nurseries would soon echo with the cries of Habsburg, Bourbon infants. Instead, what followed was 7 years of the most scrutinized bedroom in European history, where royal physicians, foreign ambassadors, and gossiping courtiers obsessed over every intimate detail of a marriage that stubbornly refused to produce children. The problem, as court physicians delicately documented in their confidential reports, was that the marriage simply wasn't being consummated. Louis XV, despite being a healthy young man with normal masculine desires, suffered from a condition that modern medicine would diagnose as phimosis, a tightening of the foreskin that made sexual intercourse painful, and in his case apparently impossible. This medical reality transformed what should have been a honeymoon period into an increasingly desperate series of interventions, consultations, and attempted treatments that would make any modern couple file for divorce on grounds of medical malpractice. The mainstream historical record confirms that the unconsummated marriage became such a diplomatic crisis that the Austrian ambassador was filing regular reports to Vienna about the couple's sexual activities, causing lack thereof bid the kind of detailed attention usually reserved for military intelligence. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, began bombast that ranged from dietary recommendations to specific sexual techniques, creating what was essentially Europe's first long-distance sex techniques. Some scholars debate whether Louis XV's condition was purely physical or complicated by psychological factors, with recent historical analysis suggesting that the intense pressure to perform sexually for the sake of international diplomacy, the young couple found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario where their most intimate moments were subject to medical examination, political analysis, and international gossip that spread from Versailles to every royal court in Europe. Court physicians began conducting what they termed marital examinations, essentially post-coital inspections, designed to determine whether consummation had occurred and whether pregnancy might be possible. These humiliating procedures involved multiple doctors examining both Met and Louis Fimney for physical evidence of sexuality. The palace's head physician, Dr. Lasson, became something of a reproductive detective, analyzing bedsheets, monitoring the couple's physical conditions, and prescribing an increasingly bizarre array of treatments designed to facilitate consummation. His medical journals, preserved in the French National Archives, read like a combination of sex manual and torture chamber instructions, complete with detailed diagrams of recommended positions and timing strategies. Louis Wisems underwent a series of increasingly invasive medical procedures, including attempted manual stretching, application of various oils and unguents, and what 18th century medicine optimistically called therapeutic manipulation. Modern medical historians wince at the descriptions of these treatments, which likely caused more pain and psychological trauma than they relieved. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette endured her own medical ordeals, including examinations to confirm her virginity, treatments designed to prepare her body for conception, and dietary regimens that were supposed to enhance her fertility, despite the obvious fact that fertility wasn't the immediate problem. The court's obsession with the royal couple's sexual dysfunction reached such absurd heights that palace servants were questioned about laundry stains, bedroom noises, and the timing of the couple's private meetings. Even their breakfast conversations were analyzed for clues about their nocturnal activities, creating an atmosphere where privacy became impossible and intimacy virtually unattainable. The political implications of the unconsummated marriage grew more serious with each passing year. French nobles began whispering that their future king was sexually inadequate, while Austrian diplomats worried that the alliance between Vienna and Versailles would collapse if Marie Antoinette failed to produce heirs. Foreign ambassadors filed reports, speculating about the couple's sexual problems, with some suggesting that the marriage should be annulled and Marie Antoinette returned to Austria as damaged goods. The psychological toll on Marie Antoinette was devastating, as she found herself blamed for a problem that was entirely beyond her control. Court gossips suggested she was too frigid, too demanding, or somehow physically inadequate, while her mother's letters became increasingly critical and desperate. The young queen began developing what modern psychologists would recognize as anxiety disorders, with reports of sleeplessness, loss of appetite, and episodes of uncontrollable crying that palace physicians attributed to female hysteria, rather than the obvious stress of living in a sexual fishbowl. Louis Fizim, meanwhile, retreated into his hobbies of locksmithing, wasn't constantly questioned by international observers. His political education suffered, as he became increasingly withdrawn and defensive about his perceived failures as both a husband and a future king. The couple's relationship, which had begun with genuine affection and mutual respect, became strained under the relentless pressure to perform sexually for the sake of state interests. By 1776, 6 years into their marriage, the situation had become so relentless. By 1776, Emperor Joseph T, Marie Antoinette's brother, actually traveled to Versailles specifically to counsel the couple about their marital difficulties, creating the surreal scenario of international diplomacy conducted through family sex therapy. Joseph's visit in April 1777, apparently incantations about Louis Whimsy's condition, and strategic planning for finally achieving consummation. The emperor's letters to their mother, describing these conversations, have provided historians with uncomfortably detailed insights into 18th century royal sexuality, including descriptions of Louis Whimsy's physical condition and recommendations for treatment. Whatever Joseph T said or did during his visit apparently worked, because by late 1777, palace physicians finally reported evidence. The news spread through Versailles like wildfire, with courtiers celebrating as if France had won a major military victory rather than simply achieved what most couples managed on their wedding night. The 7-year delay had created such intense anticipation that the simple fact of consummation became a cause for national celebration, with church bells ringing and Thanksgiving masses conducted throughout France. Marie Antoinette's first pregnancy, finally achieved in early 1778, wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a diplomatic triumph that validated the Franco-Austrian alliance and proved that the royal couple could fulfill their primary dynastic obligation. But as the court celebrated this long-awaited reproductive breakthrough, no one could have predicted that Marie Antoinette's fertility, once finally activated, would trap her in a cycle of pregnancy. The 7 years of barren shame were ending, but the baby machine was just beginning to warm up for its most intensive period of operation. The confirmation of Marie Antoinette's first pregnancy in April 1778 transformed Versailles from a palace into what resembled a medical research facility dedicated to the optimization of royal reproduction. After 7 years of humiliating sexual surveillance, the Queen's finely fertile womb became the most valuable. Dr. Lassagne, the same physician who had spent years analyzing bedsheets for evidence of consummation, now shifted his obsessive attention to monitoring every aspect of Marie Antoinette's pregnancy. With the precision of a master clockmaker, his daily reports to King Louis XIV documented everything from the Queen's morning sickness patterns to her food cravings, creating what was essentially the world's first reality show about royal pregnancy minus the television cameras. The Canestream historical record confirms that Marie Antoinette's pregnancies were managed with unprecedented medical intervention for the 18th century, including daily examinations, specialized diets, and constant monitoring that would be considered excessive, even by modern obstetric standards. The palace kitchen staff received detailed instructions payments. Marie Antoinette found herself eating a carefully calibrated diet of lean meats, fresh vegetables, and herbal teas that court physicians believed would produce healthy offspring while maintaining her figure for future pregnancies. The assumption clearly was that this first pregnancy would be merely the opening act in a long-running reproductive drama that would define the rest of her reign. Her daily schedule was restructured around pregnancy management, with mandatory rest periods, gentle exercise routines, and limited social obligations designed to minimize any activities that might threaten the developing royal heir. The Queen's famous love of dancing and elaborate court entertainments was immediately curtailed, replaced by sedate walks in the palace gardens and carefully supervised legero she was carrying. Some scholars debate whether the extreme medical management of Marie Antoinette's pregnancies actually contributed to complications, with recent historical analysis suggesting that the constant stress of surveillance and intervention may have caused more problems than it prevented. The birth of Marie-Thérèse Charlotte on the 19th of December, 1778, was celebrated throughout France with the enthusiasm usually reserved for military victories or religious miracles. The infant princess, nicknamed Madame Royale, proved that the 7-year reproductive drought was finally over, and that Marie Antoinette's womb was operational and ready for continuous service. But the celebration was tinged with disappointment that this first successful pregnancy had produced a daughter rather than the male heir that France desperately needed for dynastic succession. Court physicians immediately began planning for the next pregnancy, calculating optimal recovery periods, and designing treatment regimens to ensure that Marie Antoinette would conceive again as quickly as possible. The Queen barely had time to recover from childbirth before finding herself subjected to fertility to fituration. The pressure for a male heir intensified after Marie-Thérèse's birth, with Marie Antoinette's mother writing increasingly urgent letters about the necessity of producing a son to secure the dynasty and justify Austria's investment in the French alliance. These maternal demands, remember, came from the same woman who had spent years offering detailed sexual advice to facilitate conception. In the first place, by early 1780, Marie Antoinette was pregnant again, beginning what would become a relentless cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, and recovery that would define the next decade of her life. This second pregnancy ended in heartbreak with a miscarriage in the summer of 1780, an event that sent shockwaves through both the French court and European diplomatic circles. The loss wasn't just personal tragedy, it was political crisis, raising questions about Marie Antoinette's reproductive reliability and threatening the dynastic security that her fertility was supposed to guarantee. Court physicians conducted extensive examinations to determine the cause of the miscarriage, subjecting the grieving Queen to invasive procedures designed to assess her continued fertility on planned strategies to preventing future pregnancy losses. Their medical reports, preserved in the palace archives, reveal the dehumanizing clinical detachment with which royal reproductive failure was analyzed and documented. The psychological impact of the miscarriage was compounded by the immediate pressure to conceive again, with palace physicians recommending minimal grieving time before resuming attempts at pregnancy. Marie Antoinette found herself trapped in a cycle where personal loss became palocum rather than experience, but pounds to opang marinable gracing. The third pregnancy, achieved in late 1780, proceeded under even more intensive medical supervision with court physicians, determined to prevent another loss through constant monitoring and intervention. Marie Antoinette's daily routine, became indistinguishable from a medical experiment, with her diet, exercise, sleep patterns, and even emotional state regulated according to theories about optimal pregnancy. The birth of Louis Joseph Xavier Ferniaux on the 22nd of October, 1781, finally provided France with its male heir and temporarily relieved the reproductive pressure that had been building since Marie Antoinette's arrival at Versailles. The Dauphin's birth was celebrated with nationwide festivities that lasted for weeks as France finally had its future king and the Habsburg-Bourbon alliance was secured through successful male succession. But even as courtiers celebrated the arrival of the long-awaited heir, palace physicians were already planning Marie Antoinette's next pregnancy, viewing her proven ability to produce sons as a resource that needed to be exploited while she remained young and fertile. The queen's body was no longer her own. She had become state property, managed for maximum reproductive output according to the political needs of the monarchy. The fourth pregnancy in 1783 ended with the birth of Louis Charles on the 27th of March, providing France with a second son and further demonstrating Marie Antoinette's value as a producer of male heirs. His birth was followed immediately by pressure for additional pregnancies as court advisors argued that royal families needed multiple sons to ensure dynastic continuity in case of infant mortality or political crisis. The relentless cycle of pregnancy and recovery was taking a visible toll on Marie Antoinette's health, with court observers noting that she appeared increasingly exhausted and emotionally fragile despite her continued reproductive success. Her famous beauty began to fade under the strain of constant pregnancy, childbirth, and nesting, though court painters were instructed to minimize these changes in official portrait. The birth of Sophie Halley Beatrix in July 1786 demonstrated that Marie Antoinette's reproductive capacity remained strong, though the infant's death just 11 months later revealed the tragic reality that royal babies were as vulnerable to 18th century mortality as common children. Sophie's death marked the beginning of a pattern where Marie Antoinette's pregnancies increasingly ended in loss, trauma, and renewed pressure to conceive again as quickly as possible to replace the children that died. Her sixth documented pregnancy in 1787 ended in miscarriage, followed by another pregnancy in 1788 that also resulted in loss, creating a devastating cycle where hope and heartbreak alternated with mechanical regularity. By the late 1780s, Marie Antoinette had become exactly what the Franco-Austrian alliance had intended, a baby machine that produced royal heirs on schedule. But the human cost of this reproductive efficiency was becoming impossible to ignore, as each pregnancy left her more physically and emotionally depleted. While political pressure for continued childbearing remained relentless, the irony that would soon become apparent was that just as Marie Antoinette's body was wearing out from constant pregnancy, the political stability that justified the year 1789 brought two devastating developments that would transform Marie Antoinette's reproductive history from political asset into revolutionary liability. The death of her eldest son, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, on the 4th of June, and the eruption of popular uprising that would eventually consume the monarchy she had spent 2 decades breeding to preserve. The Dauphin's death from tuberculosis at age 7 wasn't just personal tragedy. It was the collapse of everything Marie Antoinette's reproductive servitude had been designed to achieve. This boy, whose conception had taken 7 years and whose birth had secured the Franco-Austrian alliance, died just as revolutionary crowds were gathering in Paris to demand the overthrow of the very dynasty his existence was supposed to perpetuate. The timing was so cruelly ironic that even Marie Antoinette's enemies might have felt sympathy, had they not been too busy sharpening guillotines and composing pamphlets denouncing royal excess. The mainstream historical consensus confirms that Louis Joseph's death left Marie Antoinette emotionally shattered at precisely the moment when revolution aristocratic decadence, rather than dynastic duty. Revolutionary pamphleteers began calculating the cost of royal pregnancies, documenting every expense associated with Marie Antoinette's medical care, nursery preparations, and christening celebrations, as proof that the monarchy consumed resources while ordinary French families starved. Her 7-year-old son's elaborate funeral, conducted while bread riots erupted across Paris, became a symbol of royal waste that revolutionary propagandists would exploit. The revolutionary press discovered that Marie Antoinette's reproductive history was a goldmine of material for anti-monarchist propaganda, with detailed calculations showing that each royal pregnancy had cost more than most French peasants earned in their entire lifetimes. Pamphlets with titles like "The Austrian Breeding Sow" and how many French children could have been fed for the cost of one royal bastard, circulated through Marie Antoinette's. The irony wasn't lost on more thoughtful observers that the same fertility that had once secured international alliances was now being weaponized by revolutionaries to justify regicide. Some scholars debate whether the revolutionary focus on Marie Antoinette's reproductive history revette convenient propagandas once the guillotine started operating. The death of Louis Joseph elevated his younger brother, Louis Charles, to the position of Dauphin, making the 8-year-old boy both heir to a crumbling throne and target of revolutionary hatred that had previously focused on his deceased brother. Revolutionary theorist began arguing that royal children were inherently corrupted by their aristocratic birth and that allowing them to live would perpetuate the cycle of oppression that the revolution sought to break. This ideological shift transformed Marie Antoinette's surviving children from precious dynastic assets into existential threats to revolutionary progress, with their very existence challenging the egalitarian principles of the new French Republic. The royal family's attempted escape to Varennes in June 1791 was motivated partly by fears for the children's safety, as revolutionary rebels who deserved execution, regardless of their age or innocence. Marie Antoinette's role as mother became inseparable from her political identity as enemy of the revolution, with revolutionary propagandists arguing that her maternal instincts made her more dangerous because she would fight to preserve aristocratic privilege for her children. The capture at Varennes ended any remaining illusions about the royal family's safety and marked the beginning of a period where Marie Antoinette's pregnancies would become matters of revolutionary surveillance rather than dynastic separation. Palace physicians, who had once monitored her cycles to optimize conception, now found themselves documenting her reproductive status for revolutionary tribunals that viewed royal fertility as a form of counter-revolutionary activity. The suspicion that Marie Antoinette might be pregnant during her imprisonment became a source of revolutionary paranoia, as any additional royal children would complicate the Republic's plans for executing the monarchy. Revolutionary guards conducted intimate searches designed to detect signs of pregnancy, transforming the same medical surveillance that had once served dynastic interests into tools of revolutionary control. Her famous response to accusations of counter-revolutionary correspondence: "I would rather perish than bring a child into this world to suffer what we are suffering," revealed how completely her understanding of motherhood had been transformed by revolutionary circumstances. The woman who had once been pressured to produce royal heirs as quickly as possible now faced execution if she conceived children who might challenge revolutionary legitimacy. Court records from the Temple prison document several suspected pregnancies during Marie Antoinette's captivity, though whether these were genuine biological events or revolutionary paranoia remains a subject of historical speculation. The revolutionary government's obsession with Marie Antoinette's reproductive capacity reached such extremes that female guards were assigned specifically to monitor her menstrual cycles and report any irregularities that might indicate conception. These prison matrons, remember, were performing the same intimate surveillance that palace physicians had once conducted to optimize royal fertility, though now the goal was preventing rather than promoting pregnancy. The psychological torture of this reproductive monitoring was compounded by revolutionary threats against her surviving children, with guards routinely describing the punishments that awaited young Louis Charles and Marie Thérèse if their mother attempted to conceive additional royal offspring. Revolutionary tribunals debated whether executing a pregnant Marie Antoinette would be politically acceptable, with some arguing that killing royal children in utero was revolutionary acceptable. These deliberations, preserved in revolutionary archives, reveal the extent to which Marie Antoinette's reproductive capacity had become a central issue in revolutionary politics, rather than a personal matter of family planning. The death of her son Louis Charles in June 1795, while Marie Antoinette was already imprisoned and awaiting execution, eliminated the male line that her 25 years of reproductive servitude had been designed to preserve. The boy's death in prison, possibly from tuberculosis like his older brother, meant that Marie Antoinette's entire reproductive career had ultimately failed to secure the dynasty she had sacrificed her body to perpetuate. Revolutionary propagandists celebrated Louis Charles's death as the elimination of the last Capet whelp, using language that reduced Marie Antoinette's children to animals whose breeding threatened republican virtue. The transformation of her maternal identity from political asset to revolutionary liability was complete when her execution on the 16th of October 1793 was specifically justified by prosecutors who argued that her capacity for reproduction made her too dangerous to allow survival. The same fertility that had once made her valuable to the Franco-Austrian alliance now made her an existential threat to revolutions, had inverted the meaning of her reproductive history. Her final recorded words about her children, needy prayer that they would forgive their father's executioners, revealed a maternal love that transcended the political calculations that had originally brought her to France's breeding stock. The revolutionary period had transformed Marie Antoinette from baby machine into mother martyr, though the irony was that both roles ultimately served the political needs of others rather than her own desires for family happiness. The transfer of the royal family to the Temple prison in August 1792 marked the beginning of Marie Antoinette's final chapter as both queen and potential mother, where even imprisonment couldn't free her from the reproductive surveillance that had defined her adult life. The revolutionary government's paranoia about royal fertility reached new heights during her captivity, with officials convinced that any additional royal children would provide rallying points for counter-revolutionary resistance. Prison guards received explicit instructions to monitor Marie Antoinette for signs of pregnancy, transforming her cell into a medical observation unit where intimate bodily functions became matters of state security rather than personal privacy. The same reproductive capacity that had once been celebrated as France's dynastic salvation. Dr. Pierre Sue, the prison physician assigned to monitor the royal family's health, found himself conducting the same intimate examinations that palace doctors had once performed to optimize conception, though now the goal was detecting and preventing any pregnancies that might complicate revolutionary justice. His medical reports, preserved in the National Archives, document a level of reproducting Marie Antoinette had endured during her fertile years. The Decomtech, the mainstream historical record, confirms that revolutionary authorities suspected Marie Antoinette of being pregnant at least twice during her imprisonment, though whether these suspicions reflected actual biological events or paranoid delusions remains a subject of scholarly debate. The first suspected pregnancy the deposed queen had missed her monthly cycles and appeared to be suffering from morning sickness. Revolutionary tribunals responded to these reports with emergency sessions to determine whether executing a pregnant woman would undermine the moral authority of the Republic, or whether royal pregnancies were inherently counter-revolutionary, regardless of the circumstances. The debates over Marie Antoinette's potential pregnancy revealed the extent to which revolutionary ideology had transformed reproduction from a nation the foundations of democratic castorade. Some scholars debate whether the revolutionary obsession with Marie Antoinette's reproductive status reflected genuine concern about dynastic restoration, or was simply another method of psychological torture designed to break her spirit during captivity. Prison matrons were assigned to conduct daily intimate examination, searching for physical evidence for pregnant's menstrual cycle with the thoroughness of modern fertility specialists. These examinations, conducted without privacy or dignity, represented the final degradation of a woman whose body had never belonged to herself but had always served the political needs of others. The psychological impact of this reproductive surveillance was compounded by revolutionary threats against her surviving children, with guards describing in graphic detail the punishments that would await any additional royal offspring. Marie Antoinette's response to these threats, documented in letters smuggled from her cell, revealed a maternal desperation that transcended political calculation. "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than bring another child into this world to suffer as we have suffered." The second suspected pregnancy occurred in early 1793, just months before her execution, when prison physicians reported irregularities in her cycles that might indicate conception. Revolutionary authorities responded with increased security measures and accelerated plans for her trial, apparently determined to execute her before any pregnancy could progress to a stage where terminating it would create propaganda problems for the Republic. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers that the same government that proclaimed liberty and natural rights was conducting forced gynecological inseminations on political prisoners to prevent the birth of children who might challenge their authority. Prison records document the administration of various substances designed to induce menstruation if pregnancy had occurred, essentially conducting state-subtoting pregnancy termination decades before such procedures became legally or medically standardized. These interventions, carried out without Marie Antoinette's consent or even clear medical justification, represented the ultimate violation of a woman whose reproductive autonomy. The final months of her imprisonment were marked by physical deterioration that made pregnancy increasingly unlikely. The revolutionary paranoia continued to focus on her reproductive capacity, even as her health visibly declined. Her famous last letter, written to Madame Elizabeth before her execution, included references to unborn children she would never have. "I die free of hatred for those who condemned me, though I grieve for the children I will never hold, and the dynasty that dies with me." The execution of Marie Antoinette on the 16th of October, 1793, finally ended her 23-year career as royal breeding stock. The revolutionary propagandists continued to justify her death by citing the danger that her fertility had posed to Republican government. Her death marked the end of a reproductive trajectory that had begun with such hope in 1770, when a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess arrived in France, specifically to serve as a baby indicator. The transformation from celebrated fertility to revolutionary liability revealed how completely women's reproductive capacity was subordinated to political necessity. Regardless of whether the government in question was monarchist or republican, Marie Antoinette's gynecological history documented with obscenity. Her final documented menstrual cycle, recorded by prison physician Dr. Sue just weeks before her execution, represented the last entry in a reproductive record that had been monitored continuously for over 2 decades. The death of her son, Louis Charles, in prison in June 1795, nearly 2 years after his mother's execution, marked a complete failure of the dynastic project that had brought her to France. The boy's death from tuberculosis and neglect in revolutionary custody provided a tragic coda to a story that had begun with such optimism about the power of royal fertility to secure international alliances and dynastic continuity. The revolutionary government's treatment of Marie Antoinette's reproductive capacity. Her story demonstrates how female fertility became a political resource to be managed, exploited, and ultimately eliminated when it no longer served the interests of those in power, regardless of the personal cost to the women whose bodies were treated as state property. The final irony of Marie Antoinette's reproductive history was that despite producing 4 children, miscarriages, and medical interventions, her fertility ultimately failed to preserve either her own life or the dynasty she had sacrificed her body to perpetuate. As the blade of the guillotine fell on that October morning in 1793, it severed not just a queen's neck, but the final connection between the woman who had arrived in France as breeding stock and the political system that had valued her only for her capacity to produce heirs. And so ends the tale of history's most thoroughly documented baby machine, a woman whose 23 years of reproductive servitude ultimately achieved enough political problems that required more than biological solutions. The gentle autumn breeze that stirred the leaves around the Place de la Révolution that day seemed to whisper the final verdict on Marie Antoinette's reproductive career. That no amount of pregnancy, no matter how carefully managed or politically motivated, could save a monarchy that had lost the trust of its people. Her story drifts away now into the peaceful silence of history, where queens no longer serve as baby machines, and where women's bodies belay now into the peaceful silence of April. Let these ancient sorrows fade into the darkness of night, where even the most tragic tales of reproductive servitude can find rest in the gentle embrace of sleep, and where the echoes of palace physicians and revolutionary guards can no longer disturb the peace of those who remember Marie Antoinette, not as a failed dynasty, but as a woman whose body was never her own. Sleep now, knowing that the age of royal baby machines has passed into history's museum of forgotten cruelties, and that the morning will bring stories of women who controlled their own destinies rather than serving as breeding stock for the ambitions of others.